Now, a little enhancement to our context. It is a good idea to also add your functions, like onLogout in my case, to the default context when you create the context. And there you can just store a dummy function which does nothing. I'm doing this for better IDE autocompletion, because you will see that if I don't have this here, in the navigation component, here if I try to call onLogout, I'm not getting any suggestion by my IDE. It doesn't know that there is an onLogout prop. On the other hand, you will see that there is this isLoggedIn suggestion. Now that's simply happening because the way React works and the way Visual Studio Code at least works, it's looking at this default context object to find out what you are able to access on your context. So for better IDE autocompletion, it is a good idea to add onLogout here in your default context object as well, just with a dummy function, because we're not going to use this anyways. And then here, you will see that now I get this onLogout autocompletion. So that's just a tiny hint you might consider because it can be helpful. Another thing that you might consider is, depending on your application structure and how you're managing your data, you also might want to pull more logic out of, for example, app component and create a separate context management component, if you want to call it like this. How could this look like? Well, maybe in our authContext store file, we could create a authContextProvider component now actually, where we return authContext.provider and we accept props and simply pass whatever we got on props children between our provider. And then here, I don't just export authContext as the default, but I also export my authContextProvider in addition to the default as a named export. Now, why am I doing that? Because now we can actually also import useState here inside of the authContext.js file and manage the isLoggedIn state and set isLoggedIn here inside of this authContextProvider. Add the logout handler function here, where I set isLoggedIn to false, and also add the login handler function here now, so that we manage the entire authentication state in this separate provider component. And here I set isLoggedIn to true, of course. And then I set the value here, of course, to an object where I have isLoggedIn, which is equal to the isLoggedIn state, where I have onLogout, which points at the logout handler, and in addition, where we now also have onLogin, which points at the login handler. And therefore, I will also add this to my default context here, onLogin, with a dummy function, just making it clear that we there want the email and a password. We're not doing anything with that data, but technically we would need it in a real app. And now we have this standalone file which manages the entire login state in this authContextProvider component, and which also sets up all the context. And the advantage here could be, and I'm saying could because this is something you can consider, it always depends on your preferences, the exact use case, and the size of your app, but this is something you could consider, because now we can strip that all out of app component. We of course also though need to move over our local storage access here. So clear data in the logout handler, set our data in the login handler, and of course also add our useEffect code here. That all now needs to go into our authContextProvider, and therefore we also need to import useEffect here. But with that all, we can now clear all that logic here from the app component, remove these hook imports here, remove our auth context import here, remove all of that, and therefore, of course, bring back React fragment like this. And I'm doing this because now we can wrap the app component as a whole, so therefore an index component, which is where we render the app component, with auth context provider. So with our auth context provider component, which we just created and exported in the auth context file. And with that, we have one central place for the state management, for the auth state management, I should say. And that central place is now not the app component, but a dedicated context component and a dedicated context file. And this might be a structure you might prefer because it is more focused and gives you a leaner app component, which now is not concerned with app-wide state management, but which now instead can just focus on, well, bringing something onto the screen. Of course, since I'm now using isLoggedIn here, I need to be able to get that information. So now in the app component, we want to use useContext and pass our auth context, not the provider, but still the auth context object, which is our default export in the auth context file. And therefore, we now got our context here as well, and hence we can access it here. And now we could even remove the onLogin and onLogout props here, because we're not managing the logout and login handlers in app component anyways. And now tap into context in the home and login components. So in the home component, we can now also import useContext and get access to our auth context, maybe to mix up the naming and make it clear what's in there, to which context we're listening here, by importing auth context and passing it to useContext. Again, use auth context here, not the provider. And then here we can use auth ctx.onLogout and do something similar in the login component. Import useContext here. And then in our component function, maybe here, we can set up our auth context by calling useContext and passing auth context to it. For that, make sure you are importing auth context, of course. And then we can use auth context when we need to log in. So here it's not props on login, but auth ctx on login, to which we forward the email and password. Now, again, this is totally optional. The advantage here could just be that you have a leaner app component, which again is now just focused on returning JSX and bringing something onto the screen, and you have the actual auth state management and auth context management all in one file. And some developers, including myself, often prefer this more focused and separated approach, where you have components where every component has one job essentially and not a ton of jobs. And therefore I'm a fan of this split, but as so often it's not the only way of doing this, and it's also not the only correct way. It's definitely a practice that is worth looking into though, a practice you might see in projects out there, and therefore something that of course needs to go into a course like this, which has the job of turning you into a real React developer. And therefore you have to know patterns like this, which is why we refactored this. With all of that out of the way, let's test our application to ensure that this still works. And that all seems to work to me here. Let's also check the logout button here. Yeah, that all works now with one central context, with one central state management.